Good morning. I'm just going to continue with my series on the World Chess Championships between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Deng Liren. The first game was a draw. The second game was won by Jan. The third game was a win for Deng. It was a draw, sorry, and the fourth game was a win for Deng to equalise the match. We're now in the fifth game, and here Nepo has the white pieces and Deng has the black pieces. Let's see what happens. So, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6 to defend the pawn. Bishop c5, Spanish opening, Ruy Lopez, to threaten the knight, which is the defender of the pawn. Pawn comes to a6, asks the question of the bishop. The bishop says, I haven't decided yet, and retreats. Yeah, the knight comes out. And black castles. Yeah, if you want to try and risk taking this pawn, the rook's going to come c1. You're not going to be able to hold on to the pawn for very long. So the bishop comes to e7. This makes it a closed defence because it's less likely now that pawns will be exchanged and the position will be opened up. But d3 to defend the pawn on e4, because now if he doesn't defend the pawn he can take it with the knight, and when the knight retreats you're not threatening, this pawn isn't pinned anymore, so it's harder to win it back, so he defends it. And the pawn comes to b5 and threatens the bishop, which retreats to b3. You can't come after the bishop with knight a5. Well, you can come after the bishop with knight a5, but then the pawn on e5 falls, so he has to defend it before he can think about attacking the bishop, and he defends it. And Nepo plays c3 to give his bishop a retreat square to preserve the important light squared bishop, which in this opening is known as the Spanish bishop. In the Italian opening it's known as the Italian bishop. But the light squared bishop is very important for future kingside attacks, which can be directed against this weak point here and sometimes against this weak point here. So it's very important to preserve that bishop, and that's what he's doing with the move c3. Deng castles kingside, and instead of letting the bishop come here and then chasing it away, and then it goes here and chasing it further and creating weaknesses, particularly on this square in your position, Nepo stops the bishop from coming there in the first place, which encourages him to play the bishop to b7, a move he might well have considered anyway. So the pawn comes to a4. This is to combat the space which black has grabbed on the queen side, but it also gives him another possibility, which is the possibility of retreating the bishop here. And the bishop is attacked, and it's exactly here that he retreats it. This is an unusual move. It's not a bad move. It just isn't often played. It's a very flexible move because later, after you've moved the knight, bishop and rook, you can come to b1 with the bishop if need be. So you hold open both diagonals. You don't choose one or the other at this point in time. So it's a good flexible move. The pawn comes to c5, making a further grab for space in the centre, but it's worth noting that immediately the pawn on d6 becomes backwards and yeah, somewhat weaker, and surely Nepo will try to direct some play against that pawn. Well, he plays a bishop to g5. This is in a subtle way directed against the d6 pawn because he's threatening to take the bishop and the knight comes away, which means it was no longer defending the d6 square. It also makes more of a play to establish a piece on the d5 square, which will be fine for black. So the question is put to Nepo, but he doesn't hesitate. He takes it right away. He's got a plan. And then he takes the pawn here, and the a file is opened, and the knight comes to d2. Yeah. Now he's just short of moving his queen to be finished with his development. The knight has to get back in the game, so it comes back to c6, and the bishop threatens it, and opens up the attack on the rook. It's taken, the queen takes it, and the bishop comes here, and he's threatening to come to a1, a8 with his rook and take control of the a file. Nepo puts his rook on the e file. He thinks it's more important than the a file. We'll see. Yeah, the queen goes to d1, out of the way. Yeah, ready to do some attack and play. Bishop to d8. We've seen this actually in the first and I think the second World Championship match from Stein. It's the bishop is placed really well on d8. It looks at both sides of the board, and you're not bothered any longer about a lack of coordination between the rooks, because there is only one rook. There is no coordination between the rooks. So d8 is a very fine square for the bishop. This was far from being the most accurate World Championship match ever played, but they both played exciting attacking chances. They both tried to win the games. So I'm not complaining about the lack of accuracy. And nobody's going to be able to complain about the number of draws because they were less than usual. So knight comes to f1. He might be looking at coming to f3. At g3, sorry, might be looking at e3. Eventually, it can come into f5. But from g3, he could also come to h5. So it has some flexible plans. The knight comes to e7 to threaten the bishop on d5. So he takes the bishop on b7 and the queen takes back. And we've got two knights against a bishop and knight. How do we assess this situation? Well, as a fool whittling on about chess, I would assess it as being at the least a small advantage for white because of the weakness of the d6 pawn. Or you could say the d3 pawn is just as weak, but the d3 pawn isn't just as weak because white can play pawn to d4 and the pawn is then supported. So yeah, black has a little bit more space potentially, but you know, there's also the potential of creating an endgame where white has a queen and knight against a queen and bishop. This is considered a theoretical advantage. Why is it considered a theoretical advantage? The answer to that is very simple. A knight can go to squares of both colours. A bishop can only go to squares of one colour. A bishop can only cover half the board. A knight can cover the whole board. Alright, it's a lot slower getting there, but it can cover the whole board, and knights are generally tricky. This counts more in shorter time formats because it's easier to miss a move that the knight could make. These two are, despite everything, fighting for the World Championships. They shouldn't be missing potential knight moves at this time. So I would guess that the evaluation is plus 0.4 to white. Let's see what it says. 0.3. Okay, I'll take that. I'll take that as a win. That was a very good judgment from me. Okay, so what does he do now? The knight comes to e3 naturally, as I said. Looking at the e5 outpost if the knight moves. Looking at f5. Looking at g5. f4. Yeah, a much better position. The bishop comes to b6. Maybe he might have ideas of moving the pawn here. If he plays queen here first, for example, pawn here becomes a potent threat. Alright, probably doesn't get him anywhere because of pawn to d4, but you know, the pawn behind is in danger. So, bit of space on the queen side. c6 to strengthen his grip on the centre and defend the bishop from a more active square. h5, great move from Nepo. This really restrains the kingside pawns for black, and also it prevents the knight from using the g6 square, from where it could come to the nice active f5 square. So that's excellent. c4, as advertised for. If he pushes, he takes. Yeah, maybe he can end up with 2 pawns in the centre, but it might be weak. So he pushes, he takes with the knight. So if he takes with the pawn takes, and he's got a pawn duo in the centre, a nice strong centre. All right, he's given up some space on the queen side, and maybe it might be possible for white to force through a pass pawn on the queen side. But he doesn't go in for any of that. He just puts his queen on a more active square, where it also incidentally attacks the pawn on h4. The queen comes to g4. Now he's threatening to play knight here, and then he's threatening mate. He might have to play rook here first to defend this pawn, so that he doesn't get mated himself. But it's a possibility. The queen comes to e5. Yeah, great. Better square, more active. And now the queen cuts off this square, so if ever he gets a check-in the back rank, it could well be mate. So yeah, a better square for the queen. Which is why Nepo doesn't tolerate the queen being on that better square and chases it away with the queen. The queen comes to e6 and proposes a queen swap. Nepo says no thank you, and Ding takes. Nepo takes with the f pawn, so that he's got the e pawn, so that he's got 2 pawns honed in on the enemy king, and he's just taken control of an open file. Black has an open file, white has control of an open file, but the open file that white has control of is a central open file. Got to be better. The queen comes to f6, and the queen uses the control of the open file to come to d4, e4, and attack the rook on a8. Alright, easy enough to move the rook out of the attack, but it gives him a tempo for his advance. And now the rook comes to e2 to defend this pawn and this pawn. Equally importantly, this rook is now on a white square where this bishop doesn't see it. And we're getting an ideal form of that situation I talked about earlier, where a knight plays against the queen and knight plays against the queen and bishop. And some of the advantages of that kind of situation can be seen in this game. So bishop comes to c5, it's a better square, why not? Defends this pawn, he might be able to play rook here and push the pawn to d5, who knows. A lovely little pawn formation that really puts the squeeze on black, sorry. Yeah, queen comes back to d8, and the queen comes to d5. Great. Sights himself in on this square, blockades this pawn. Yeah, just takes a good grip on the game. King comes to f8. Yeah, the king belongs in the centre. There isn't big mating dangers, so the king needs to be more active. And white makes his king more active, and the rook comes to c8. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe he just feels that it's on a more defended square on c8. The rook comes to e4, brilliant. And the rook goes back to b8. This forward and backwards with the rook shows that Ding doesn't feel comfortable with any other moves. Of course, if he moves one of these pawns, he makes a weakness. If he moves this pawn, well, then it's probably going to just get snapped off. And this pawn will then become weak. It's a tough position for Ding. So that's why he's just shuffling back and forward with the rook. And now, Nepo makes the break. g5. He doesn't really have a choice but to take it. Of course, he can't take back. Is it a pawn sacrifice? Not really, because defending the pawn with f6 would be a disaster for white. It would just leave so many holes in his position. The rook comes to a8, yeah. Got an open file, why not use it? The knight takes the pawn, so now they're level on pawns again. Rook comes to a1 check, and the king comes to f2. Really, really smart, because if he'd come to g2, you might think, well, that's great, come to g2, but then the queen comes to a8, and the queen is pinned to the queen, and it would force a queen swap off in unfavourable circumstances. But this exposes him to a check, which Ding uses straight away. He puts himself in a pin. You've got to be really careful when going for a self pin, because sometimes those pieces can get trapped. But he's worked out what he wants to do here. And the king comes to f3, a great square, a white square, out of the way of the bishop and also out of the way of all checks, and now the knight is free to move. Queen comes to 8, he wants to swap queens off. Nepo's perfectly willing to swap off queens at this point in time. Is he really going to get anywhere with those broken up pawns on the king side? Yeah, he thinks so. And he pushes the pawn. Of course, if the pawn is taken, then Nepo has a pawn here, and he's threatening rook takes. Rook here check to win the rook on e8. So the pawn comes to g6, it just gets taken straight away. And he takes it. And the rook comes to a2, threatening the pawn here. And the king comes to g4. The pawn is taken, and the rook comes to h6, and Ding resigns. Why does he resign in this situation? What is so bad about it? He can't win this pawn, it's defended by the knight. This pawn's defended by the knight. This pawn's defended by the knight. Nepo can wander here and here with the king, and then he can say check here, and then he can push the pawn, and then he can get a new queen. And it can't really be stopped. The threats of queening the pawn and the threats of mating cannot be stopped. And Ding realises this and gives up. So Nepo goes back in the lead. And really, this, apart from the opening, was one that was played in the 1900s. This really reminds me of the early Steinitz matches for the World Championship. Maybe the first match against Chigorin, or the first match against Sukertorp, where there was a long run where one player won and then another player won, where many games were won in a row. And this is the situation that happens now. We know, after having a bit of a sterile beginning with a couple of draws and a couple of wins, suddenly we are up to, after game 5, into a period where there are many wins in a row. A very exciting period. Not, as I have said, the most accurate chess ever played, but we're not complaining about that. That's perfectly acceptable. That's the nature of the game. Yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment on my videos. Thanks. Bye.